And turning now to the aftermath of the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, local residents are reluctant to accept advice from officials, saying that it's safe to return home 12 days after the accident. People are complaining about health issues. Lilia Luciano has more.
I would be alert and concerned, but I think I would probably be back in my house.
That was Ohio Governor Mike DeWine's answer when he was asked whether he would move back home if he lived in East Palestine, Ohio, though he did offer caveats.
I think that I would be drinking the bottled water.
There have been numerous reports in recent days of respiratory issues, burning eyes, and dead wildlife, including at least 3,500 confirmed dead fish killed by contamination.
We don't have any evidence of non-aquatic species suffering from the derailment.
5 of the train cars were carrying vinyl chloride, a highly combustible chemical linked to a higher risk of some kinds of cancers. Crews conducted a controlled release of the carcinogen to reduce the risk of an explosion.
When you have combustion or burning, you create all sorts of different byproducts. It's important to understand to cast a wide net when you're testing, because you want to narrow out and rule out chemicals that could pose an acute health risk or linger around.
The governor and other officials lifted the town's evacuation order a week ago after health officials said air quality was back to acceptable levels and the city's main water supply, they said, was safe. 2 days after the evacuation order was lifted, the EPA said 3 additional hazardous chemicals were found on the derailed train cars.
This train apparently was not considered a high hazardous material train.
Yesterday, Governor DeWine revealed that since only 20 of the 150 cars contained hazardous materials, the company, citing federal law, was not required to notify the state of Ohio that the train had toxic chemicals on board.
Frankly, if this is true, and I'm told it's true, this is absurd.
So joining us now with a little bit more on this is Dr. Lynn Goldman. She is the Dean of the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, I know if I lived in this area, I would be very concerned about whether or not it's safe after, a week and a half. So let's just talk about certain things. Let's talk about the water. We're hearing about fish dying. We're hearing about officials saying, listen, I would drink the bottled water and not the water in this area. What questions should residents be asking to determine whether or not their water is indeed safe?
Well, I do think that it is important to look at the water very carefully when you know that huge numbers of gallons of these chemicals had to be released in order to stop them from exploding there, and that a lot of that poured into the water. Then there is some possibility of that eventually reaching drinking water supplies. Not overnight. It takes a while for chemicals to move in the environment, but certainly there is that possibility. What could happen first in terms of contamination is private wells that are in the area, because it seems that the public water supplies are a bit farther away from where the spill occurred. But I would be very concerned about this myself, particularly if I had my own well. And I don't think there's any harm done in using bottled water. A lot of people drink bottled water anyway.
But what about, taking a bath? Stuff like that. I mean, you don't just drink the water. You do a lot of other things that I think would be concerning.
Well, theoretically, if there were vinyl chloride in the water and none has been found at this point, it could be released in a shower, a bath, cooking. But right now, that hasn't been the case. But again, if I had a private well and I were very, very close to this, I might even want to use bottled water for cooking.
I wonder if we can talk a bit about the air quality here, because the EPA says it's been monitoring air quality. They say it has not detected any levels of concern. Can you explain, Lynn, how you think that they may have gotten to that conclusion and whether or not in your assessment it's accurate?
Well, so here's the problem. In the immediate time of an incident like this, there aren't monitors running around that area. Nobody was anticipating that such a thing would happen. By the time that the EPA is in there with monitors, many of the releases would have occurred. So I don't think we'll ever know what the levels were in the critical few hours right after the incident occurred. But we do know that once a fire has burned out, once an incident has finished, we don't expect chemicals like vinyl chloride nor particulates to linger in the air. The problem is that during that initial period, even before there was much monitoring, and before people left the area, because it is difficult to get people to evacuate right away after an incident like this, there probably are people who were breathing, whether it was smoke or particles or even possibly chemicals in the air. And I think there's probably going to be the need for some kind of a medical check to make sure that they didn't suffer any lung damage from that. Or the other thing that I've seen happen is damage to the eyes from things that are in the smoke, like if, for example, if there were acids that were released, as they did report that they did have at the time of the fire.
Really quickly, Doctor, no surprise, already a federal lawsuit has been filed by a couple of residents in the area. They want, ongoing health monitoring and related services for, to deal with the effects, not just immediate, but perhaps long-term effects. Can you talk to us about what federal protections are in place that already exist for residents when they have to deal with these types of incidents?
Well, you saw that there was quite a bit of a speed of a response, by both the EPA and the ATSCR. And so, there is the ability for responders to come. However, I would say that there are aspects in which the federal protections are not strong enough. The fact that our aging and in some ways weakening infrastructure around rail transport is used to transport vast quantities of these kinds of toxic chemicals, and that it's even possible to have an incident like this. I don't call it an accident, and I don't call it an accident because it's inevitable that there are going to be derailments and spills given what we're doing. So I do think that there's some strengthening that needs to happen there. I also think there are limits to what the federal government will be able to do to address the needs of the community. But it's very important that those community members, if they're observing things, if they believe that they have animals that are dying, if they're observing health problems, that they document those things. That's extremely important. And that gives the ability of the federal officials and others to actually investigate those incidents.
Okay, some good advice there. Dr. Lynn Goldman, thanks so much for that.
Thank you.